All right, picture this, folks. It's January 1953, cold as hell in Washington, D.C., and Dwight freaking Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, the man who crushed Nazi Germany and became the face of victory itself, is about to take over as President of the United States. But behind the cameras, behind the smiling handshakes, there's a quiet storm brewing, a years-long grudge, a personal beef that goes way back to the end of World War II. And it's aimed straight at the man still living in the White House, Harry S. Truman. Now, on the surface, these dudes looked like they played nice, like, oh yeah, peaceful transfer of power, kumbaya, democracy in action. But nah, behind the scenes, Ike basically told his staff, his driver, his closest aides, and probably even his damn dog, I'm not stepping into Truman's White House unless I absolutely gotta. And trust me, this wasn't some petty little mood swing. This had roots deeper than the Normandy hedgerows. See, after WW2 ended and America started shifting from wartime hero worship to civilian politics, Truman, who'd inherited the presidency after FDR died, felt threatened as hell by Eisenhower's popularity. Like Truman loved Ike publicly, but deep down he knew that if Ike ever wanted the Oval Office, it was game over for any Democrat in sight. And that fear turned into pressure, then into disrespect, and then into a straight-up insult that Ike never forgot. Truman tried to drag Eisenhower into politics early, tried to manipulate him, tried to paint him as his guy. And when Ike refused to play puppet, Truman snapped back with comments that Ike took real personal. Stuff about loyalty, duty, and even accusing Ike of allowing certain policies in post-war Europe to go sideways. And if there's one thing Ike couldn't stand, it was someone questioning his integrity after he'd literally held the free world together. Then came the cherry on top, the 1948 Democratic Convention. Truman secretly wanted Eisenhower to run as a Democrat, his Democrat, basically to save Truman's weak political momentum. And when Ike refused again, Truman acted like he'd been stabbed in the back by his own general, making little digs and remarks that traveled through the political grapevine and hit Ike harder than a winter at Bastogne. So fast forward to Inauguration Day 1953. Truman sends his car to pick up the president-elect, standard tradition. But Eisenhower is like, nope, not getting in that thing, straight up refuses the escort, and instead takes his own ride, his own people, his own dignity, making a silent statement that said louder than any speech, "You disrespected me, Harry, and I didn't forget." And when the two men finally met face to face on the way to the ceremony, the tension was thick enough to stop traffic. Truman tried small talk, Ike gave him cold, clipped answers, and the whole nation saw the handshake, but had no idea the history behind it, the cracks beneath it, or the quiet fury Eisenhower carried from the war years into his presidency. All right, buckle up, because this next part swings the camera way back to the end of World War II, right when Truman had first stepped into the Oval Office and Eisenhower was still the big dog in Europe, cleaning up the wreckage of a continent torn apart by Hitler's madness. See, when FDR died in April '45, the whole damned world shook. And Truman, who'd been vice president for just 82 days, suddenly found himself in charge of a global war he barely had full intel briefings on. Meanwhile, Ike was over in Europe, making decisions that could make or break the future of Western civilization. And Truman, trying to look strong, tried to assert authority over this war hero he'd barely even met. But here's the catch. Everybody adored Eisenhower. Soldiers, press, foreign leaders, even people who couldn't point out Luxembourg on a map. And Truman knew it, felt it, hated it. So he tried to rope Ike into politics early, sending little hints, little nudges, little "America needs you" messages that were really just "help me stay in power" wrapped in patriotic wrapping paper. And every time Ike politely pushed back, Truman got more irritated. Like, "Come on, man, I'm the president, don't make me beg." But Ike wasn't about to sell himself to any party. He was a soldier, not some political puppet dancing for votes. Then came the breaking point. Truman publicly credited Marshall for victory in Europe and barely mentioned Ike at all, which in D.C. circles was basically a slap across the face with a velvet glove. Sure, Eisenhower admired Marshall, loved him like a father, but it wasn't about credit, it was about Truman using praise like a weapon, rewarding the general who stayed out of politics and brushing off the one he thought might threaten him. Ike heard about it, smiled politely, but inside he was thinking, "Seriously? After everything I did, all the nights I spent awake staring at maps, playing the boys made it home alive, you're going to pretend I was just some guy?" That was the seed. Small, quiet, but poisonous. And over the next few years, Truman kept poking at it, questioning Ike's decisions in occupied Germany, making passive-aggressive remarks about Eisenhower possibly joining the GOP, even calling Ike's friends reactionary crackpots. And Eisenhower, cool-headed as always, didn't fire back publicly, but he carried that bitterness like a stone in his pocket. So by the time 1952 rolled around and Ike announced he was running on the Republican side, Truman exploded, calling him ungrateful, calling him a traitor to the party, even whining that Ike only ran because he loved applause. And Eisenhower, who'd seen men die on beaches, in forests, in frozen foxholes, was like, "Buddy, you don't know the first damn thing about me." That's the real context behind the Inauguration Day freeze-out. This wasn't some petty disagreement. This was years of bruised pride, political manipulation, and Truman treating Eisenhower like a rival instead of the war hero who helped save the free world.
Now here's where the story gets spicy. Because while all that political back and forth was simmering like a pot about to boil over, something deeper was going on behind the curtain. Something personal, something that stuck in Eisenhower's chest like shrapnel long after the war was over. See, Truman had this habit of taking things way too personal. Like if a guy disagreed with him, even politely, Truman acted like the dude had insulted his entire family tree. And with Ike, that insecurity turned into a weird kind of jealousy. Truman once told journalists he didn't understand why people idolized Eisenhower. He said Ike never fired a shot and never saw a battlefield up close, which to American ears sounded like Truman was trying to strip the shine off the man who orchestrated the entire liberation of Europe. And trust me, that comment got all the way back to Ike, who'd spent years writing letters to grieving mothers, consoling broken soldiers, and making decisions that kept the Allies from tearing each other apart. So hearing Truman say that, it felt like a cheap shot from a guy who never tasted the mud of the front lines. And it didn't stop there. When Truman sent General MacArthur packing in 1951, the country practically went nuclear with outrage, and everyone looked to Eisenhower, wondering if he'd defend Truman or MacArthur. Ike stayed neutral in public, but Truman convinced himself that Eisenhower secretly sided with MacArthur. And in Washington politics, "I think you don't like me" quickly becomes "I'm your enemy now." So by the time the 1952 election rolled around, Truman and Ike were basically two old bulls stumping around the same pasture, each convinced the other was trying to steal his legacy. Then election night hits. Ike wins in a landslide. The crowd goes nuts. The country celebrates. But Truman? He sits there in the White House looking like someone unplugged his Christmas lights, mumbling that Eisenhower had no right to run against his party and calling him a Judas behind closed doors. And the craziest part? After winning, Eisenhower sent Truman a polite note thanking him for the transition cooperation. But Truman read it like it was sarcasm, like Ike was rubbing it in. That's how fragile things had become. Two grown men, both giants of American history, both too proud to admit how much they'd hurt each other, both pretending to be civil while carrying decades of resentment. So when Inauguration Day finally arrived, and tradition said Truman should invite Eisenhower into the White House, give him coffee, shake hands like they're best pals, Eisenhower was like, "Nope, not today, not after all that noise." And right there, silently, without saying a word, Ike broke a tradition that had stood for generations, letting the whole country feel the frost between them, even if they didn't know the reason behind it.
All right, now we're sliding into the part where the drama goes from cold shoulders to full-on "these dudes ain't ever gonna be friends again" energy. Because after Ike crushed the election, the whole D.C. bubble started buzzing about what the transition meeting inside the White House was gonna look like. Except, plot twist, there was no real meeting. At least, not the kind Truman expected. See, every president-elect since forever got the full tour, the sit-down, the briefing at the Oval Office desk like, "Here's where you'll run the free world, champ." But Eisenhower straight-up dodged all that like he was juking a linebacker. He agreed to the minimum, the bare minimum, and only because protocol forced him. And when he finally stepped foot in the White House weeks before inauguration, not only was he stiff as a fence post, but his wife Mamie? Oh, she was cold enough to freeze paint, because she remembered something most people forgot. Back when Truman tried dragging Ike into politics in the late 40s, he also dragged the Eisenhower family name through the mud, hinting Ike's loyalty wavered, implying Ike didn't know his place, and even suggesting Mamie pushed her husband toward Republican circles. Mamie took that personally, extremely personally, and let's just say Eisenhower marriages ran on loyalty like tanks ran on fuel. So when she walked those halls next to Truman and Bess, the air felt like two storms brushing past each other without touching. Then came the infamous car moment. Truman sent the official White House limousine to pick up Ike on Inauguration morning. The same classy ride every president-elect accepted as a symbol of unity. But Ike basically looked at it and said, "Nah, I got my own reels," which, in political language, was a nuclear-level message. So Truman, pissed off and embarrassed, had to ride alone from the White House to the Capitol, while Eisenhower rolled up in a completely separate car, like he was arriving to evict a tenant instead of taking over the presidency. And the awkwardness didn't stop there. When they finally got together in the Capitol, Truman tried cracking jokes, trying to act like the bigger man in front of cameras. But Ike shut that down instantly with short replies, straight posture, eyes forward. The kind of cold military discipline that says, we don't have business here except what the Constitution requires. Reporters noticed, staff noticed, foreign diplomats noticed. Hell, even the Marine band playing patriotic music felt like it was trying to drown the tension. And the wildest part? Truman kept insisting publicly that he and Ike got along fine. But privately he told aides, he hates my guts and I don't know why. Which was hilarious, because Ike knew exactly why. And so did every insider who'd watched their relationship die inch by inch through the 40s and early 50s. What we were witnessing that morning wasn't just a chilly handshake. It was two world-altering egos closing a chapter without forgiveness, without apology, without even a nod to the fact that America had never seen a transition this frosty before.
Now we roll into the moment that historians still argue about in back rooms and dusty archives. The instant the official ceremony kicked off, where Truman and Eisenhower stood side by side, like two generals forced into a ceasefire they didn't want. Each man pretending not to feel the weight of nearly a decade of resentment pressing between them. See, when they climbed those steps at the Capitol, Truman tried acting casual, nodding to the crowd, smiling like nothing was wrong. But Ike had that tight-lipped, I'm only here 'cause duty demands it look you'd see on a commander about to brief a mission he hated. And everybody in the front rows, senators, foreign attachés, generals, felt that cold blast straight through their coats. Then came the handshake, the one plastered all over newspapers the next day. That stiff, awkward 2-second moment where Truman grabbed Eisenhower's hand with all the fake warmth of a salesman pushing a bad deal, while Eisenhower's fingers barely curled back, like he was holding something fragile he didn't want to commit to. And no matter what the photos tried to sell, that handshake wasn't unity. It was a peace treaty written in invisible ink. Then, as the ceremony rolled on, Truman kept leaning toward Ike, trying to say small things under the wind and applause, probably something like good luck or you'll do great, but Ike never turned his head fully. His eyes stayed locked forward, scanning the crowd like he was back on the reviewing stand at a victory parade in '45. Only this time, the enemy wasn't the Axis, it was the past. And that past was thick. Truman remembered the moments he felt Ike disrespected him during occupation decisions. Eisenhower remembered the snide comments Truman made questioning his wartime courage. And each memory sat between them like a brick wall with no door. Then came the oath. Eisenhower raised his right hand. Truman stood inches away. And as Ike repeated the words that made him president, Truman suddenly realized he wasn't passing the torch to a friend, or a partner, or even a colleague. He was passing it to the man he feared would erase his entire legacy. And maybe that's why, in the exact second the oath ended, Truman's face fell a little. Not sadness, not pride, but something like resignation. Like he knew he'd lost the last bit of control in a rivalry he never truly won. Meanwhile, Ike, now officially president, didn't even glance Truman's way. Instead, he stepped toward the crowd, toward the future, toward a White House he refused to enter earlier that morning, because deep down he didn't want to owe Truman even a symbolic gesture of respect. And that, right there, in that silent micro-moment, was when America finally saw the truth.
This wasn't just a frosty transition. It wasn't just political beef. It wasn't even personal insult anymore. It was the end of a long, slow, painful fracture between two men who shaped the world, but couldn't stand each other enough to share a damn limousine.
All right, now we're sliding into the part of the story where the public saw the fireworks, but not in the sky, in the damn body language. Because once Eisenhower wrapped up that oath, the whole vibe around the Capitol flipped like someone changed the radio station from jazz to static. Reporters later said it was the strangest transition moment they'd ever witnessed, because while the crowd roared for President Eisenhower, Truman suddenly looked like a man standing in a storm without a raincoat, trying his best to smile, trying his best to look supportive. But inside, you could practically see the gears grinding, like he knew every cheer was another reminder that America had already moved on from him. And if that wasn't awkward enough, the walk back into the building, the part where the outgoing president and the incoming one usually chat casually, shoulder to shoulder, looking like two guys about to grab lunch, well, that walk turned into a silent march that felt more like two soldiers from rival armies accidentally sharing the same trench. Ike walked slightly ahead, just a few inches, but those inches said everything. He wasn't following Truman anywhere, not symbolically, not physically, not politically. And Truman, for the first time that day, looked genuinely thrown off, because he'd always imagined himself as the seasoned leader, handing over the baton with grace. But now he was trailing behind a man who had no intention of being led. Once inside, the traditional private handshake, normally the emotional, heartfelt, good luck, you got this moment, never really happened. Truman extended his hand, Ike barely met his grip, and the whole thing took about as much time as it takes to sneeze. Then Truman, in one last attempt to break the ice, tried making a joke about the size of the crowd. Something like, "Well, General, looks like they're all here for you," with a forced chuckle. But Eisenhower didn't even crack a smile. He just nodded once, stiff as a statue, like a man who couldn't wait for this entire performance to be over. And maybe the coldest moment of all came right after. Instead of having Truman escort him to the entrance or share a final word, Eisenhower simply turned and walked away with his entourage, leaving Truman standing there for a brief second, alone, like a host whose guest left without saying thanks. That second wasn't long, but oh, it was brutally symbolic. It said, "This chapter is done. We're not friends, we're not allies, we're barely acquaintances, and we sure as hell ain't pretending anymore."
And here's where the entire story comes full circle, where the cameras finally stopped rolling, and the truth behind the coldest inauguration in U.S. history sinks in like a ship settling on the ocean floor. Because after all the speeches, all the applause, all the patriotic music echoing through the Capitol steps, the real exclamation point came when Truman climbed into his car and Eisenhower climbed into his, two engines rumbling like distant thunder as they pulled away from the same curb in opposite directions. That moment wasn't just logistics, it was symbolism carved in stone. Truman heading back to private life, shoulders heavy, legacy uncertain, and Eisenhower rolling toward the White House. Not Truman's White House, but now the Eisenhower White House, a place he refused to enter that morning because he wasn't about to let a decade of insults and political games be washed away by one polite photo op. Historians later tried to sugarcoat it, saying, well, transitions are tough. But nah, this wasn't tough. This was icy, the kind of cold only two powerful men with wounded pride could create. And the irony? Truman, despite all the bitterness, still left Eisenhower a handwritten letter on the Oval Office desk, a tradition started by Hoover, a tradition of respect, even if the respect wasn't mutual anymore. But Ike didn't open it right away, didn't smile, didn't soften. Instead, he walked into the Oval Office like a general taking command of a new front. Shoulders squared, jaw locked, ready to lead the free world, while the ghost of that feud lingered in the marble halls behind him, a reminder that even the greatest of leaders are still human, still vulnerable, still capable of carrying grudges as heavy as history itself. And in the end, that's the heart of this entire story. Two men who steered America through war and uncertainty, both brilliant, both stubborn, both proud as hell, unable to let go of wounds that time alone couldn't heal. And on that cold January day in 1953, the whole world watched them pass each other not like friends, not like partners, but like two legends who'd fought on the same side, yet never truly stood shoulder to shoulder. A silent clash of pride, politics, and memory, written not in speeches, but in the empty space between them. And that, folks, is the wild, icy, unbelievably human story behind why Dwight D. Eisenhower refused to enter Harry Truman's White House. A tale of respect earned, respect lost, and pride that echoed from the battlefields of Europe all the way to the steps of the U.S. Capitol. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden moments of history, those behind-the-scenes stories you never hear in school, then hey, do me a favor. Hit that like button, smash that subscribe, and turn on the notifications so you never miss another storytelling journey. Your support keeps these legendary stories alive, and trust me, we've got plenty more coming your way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.